Welcome to this video tutorial with Virtual Racing School for the GTE class of the IMSA Sports Car Championship on iRacing. This week we head to Interlagos, where I'll be looking at a lap by Jeremy Bouteloup with the Ford GTE, for which he's driven in default morning weather to match the official series. I'll play the lap in full for you first before then going into further analysis. Okay, so that was a 1 minute 27.994. So from the list of data packs on the VRS app, we're going to choose the IMSA Ford data pack as driven by Jeremy Bouteloup, and we're going to choose week 10, which is Interlagos. Load up the session details where you can download the lap files to compare your driving in the sim. You can also download the replay and the race setup. So I'm going to click on Learn Track, which will load up the driving analyzer. It will start to play the lap through. I'm just going to pause it and slow it to half speed and mute it. And if you're unfamiliar with this, you can see the steering angle inputs trace for this particular sector, the speed of the car throughout this corner, the brake and throttle inputs, and live driving inputs as well. So I'm just going to go back to the start of the lap and play this through. Obviously you want to have the car over to the right hand side before you start braking, which is going to be just before the 50-meter marker on the right hand side. In terms of car positioning, he's actually got his right hand side wheels over the white line. You want to be careful doing that because the track is kind of banked and then this extra runoff is flat, so you risk losing a little bit of grip potentially under braking if you do that. And the other thing is, it's the heaviest braking zone on the whole circuit to start the lap off. You're approaching at very high speed, so you can afford to brake quite hard, but still, despite that, Jeremy doesn't exceed about 75% brake pressure. The car doesn't have ABS, so you will lock up if you are too aggressive. And then you'll see that he's bleeding off the brakes for two reasons. As the car slows down, these cars are quite reliant on downforce. You lose downforce as you lose speed, so you lose grip. And the other thing is the circuit kind of falls away at the apex, so you want to actually start turning in quite early on. And as Jeremy will turn in, he also bleeds off the brake more. So we'll play that through. You can see from the steering angle input trace that he's really turning in more and more as he simultaneously bleeds off the brakes all the way down to first gear. And just before the apex, you want to be up onto this curb ideally. This is a good amount. The Ford is probably less tolerant of curbs than the Ferrari. But yeah, you want to be picking up the throttle as you apex. And you'll notice that Jeremy does not coast as well, so he's finished kind of turning in at this point, and then just as he's arriving at the apex, he's just breathing on the brake to keep the front end loaded up and avoid avoid entry understeer. And then he'll pick up the throttle on the exit fairly quickly down the hill, ensuring that he doesn't run any wider than roughly the middle of the circuit, because he wants to set the car up nicely and open up the following right-hander, which is arguably more important, especially in terms of carrying speed. So you'll see, I'll just pause it there again and go to chase view, and you can see that he's really abusing this curb. So it's quite important that you're very aggressive on your line through this right-hander, so that you can really try and maximize the speed that you're carrying, even if it means that you have to lift off the throttle as you're taking the curb. This is only a very slight lift, of course, to about 80%, and then if you've got your line correct, you'll run slightly wide onto this curb here, but the car will have enough grip to be able to maintain a nice tight line through there, opening the car up through the exit, but most importantly completely flat out. As we can see, it loads the following sector, which is the medium length straight towards turn 4. Obviously, again, keep the car over to the right hand side and prepare yourself for braking shortly after the 100-meter marker there. Another reference that you can use here is this access road, very small piece of tarmac on the right hand side. Just before there, Jeremy's going to hit the brakes, so braking quite hard initially and then bleeding off as he turns in, very similar to turn 1, except this one is a little bit faster, and Jeremy will take it in second gear instead of first gear, but again is able to use some curb and again trail brakes all the way until the apex, where he gets quite aggressively on the throttle with a little bit of modulation. And again, the corner drops away down the hill. Instead, it leads into a left-hander though, which is completely flat out. The only thing that you really need to be concerned about is if you run out onto the AstroTurf like Jeremy has done here, that you keep the car nice and straight. You can afford to do this as long as the car is relatively unloaded by the time that you run out onto the AstroTurf. And then as you exit, just keep the car nice and smooth on a smooth arc. Hit that second apex, treat it as one double apex corner, and then keep the car tight through the exit as well. No need to run it out to that curve on the right hand side because it's easily flat out. So I'm just going to pause it and go back to show you a reference that you can use for entry into the uphill right of turn 6. You've got this marshal post on the left hand side. Jeremy is going to be braking shortly before he gets alongside there, and you don't want to brake too aggressively into this one, because you'll notice in the steering trace that Jeremy already starts to turn in before he hits the brake. So it's another double apex corner, and this is going to be his first apex, this curb here on the right. You can afford to run that curb and listen out for the rumble strip. And to keep the car from understeering, which it tends to do up this hill before it crests at least, is to once again not allow the car to coast. So just maintaining 5%, maybe even less than that, on the brake pedal just to help the car rotate, because you want to be able to hit this second apex, which is also equipped with a curb. And you can see that while Jeremy reached full throttle in between those two apexes, which is very normal for a double apex corner, or at least to pick up the throttle in between the two apexes, he's actually having to bleed out of the throttle as he takes this second curb. And the other reason is the car goes quite light as the circuit crests over the hill. And then as we go into braking for turn 8, which doesn't really have a reference, the only thing that I can say is don't leave your braking too late. You can afford to be gentle on the brakes if you are too early, and we'll play it through. You can allow the car to run out onto this exit curb. Just be aware that it is slightly slippery and can make braking difficult. So you'll see the line that Jeremy takes allows for his right hand side wheels to remain on the tarmac. And again, yeah, so he's braking quite gently here, doesn't want to lock up, has to pretty much start turning in as soon as he starts braking. We can see a little bit of steering input, and then bleeds off more all the way down into first gear. Now the one thing that I would say about this corner is you can actually probably afford to use even more curb than this, so you can pretty much get the entire car on the curb without too much of a negative consequence. And then pick up the throttle carefully on the exit, because you don't want to run too wide and compromise your entry into the next left-hander of turn 9, where Jeremy has just a little squeeze on the brake just to keep the front end in, gets up on that curb, back into first gear, uses the curb to keep the car tight all the way round, and then picks up the throttle up the hill and commits to full throttle relatively quickly, given that the corner is quite long. Into turn 10 then, you've got a reference that you can use here. You've got this big tree, you've also got this access road finishing on the left hand side. Similar sort of feel to it as turn 8, except this one is a little bit tighter, and also you can't afford to use as much curb, and the exit is more important, so you want a later apex here. So picks up quite a late apex, does Jeremy, and carefully applies the throttle, uses all of the track on the exit. And the reason that you don't need to keep the car super tight through the exit to open it up this downhill left is the GTE cars have a lot more downforce than, say, a GT3 car, so it's, despite the slightly compromised entry line, still easily full throttle. And then allow the car to run out wide towards the grasscrete, this is called, I believe, on the right hand side before the final real corner, turn 12 on the circuit. Uphill braking zone, so even though you're on this relatively slippery grasscrete, there's actually plenty of grip, so you can brake quite hard. If you do need a reference, there are a few patches of dirt that you can use. I believe this is the third or second or third patch. Just make sure that you do choose the right one if you are going to use that as your braking reference. And then fairly late turn in. This corner is really all about the exit, so spot your apex as early as you can. If you need to sort of have an idea of where to be looking, look for these buildings in the distance until the apex comes into view, and then really make sure that you don't apex too early and take too much curb. And also you don't want the car to understeer, so again, try and avoid coasting if possible, and get on the throttle at the apex. Don't be too early on the throttle. It is important to get a good exit, but it's best to leave your throttle application until you do actually apex, to avoid running too wide on the exit, which is easily done. And if you do run wide onto this curb, it's likely that you'll fall off and run wider because it's got positive camber. So from this point on, it's relatively easy. Take a fairly tight line up the hill initially, let the car run out just a little bit before then bringing it back tight. I'm actually going to increase it to full speed as well, and then just cut the pit lane entrance as well, just to shorten the distance across the finish line to complete the lap. So before we end, I'm just going to show you a very quick example of some more obvious analysis from driving stats. I'm going to choose Jeremy as a teammate. I'll choose the same session for which he used as the original data pack, and I'll compare the data pack lap against a slower lap later on in the same session. I'll choose this one, lap 27. I'll go to turn number 12, where he outbrakes himself and runs wide through the exit. So we can actually see that relative to that lap, the actual data pack loses time against his later lap on corner entry, but then the data pack is much faster through the exit of the corner, and then the entirety of the full throttle section to the start finish line after getting a much better exit. So we'll just go back to the start here. You can see that the data pack lap is a little bit earlier on the brakes, and the slower lap is carrying more speed throughout the entirety of the corner entry, but actually loses speed after the apex. So we'll play it through. The two racing lines are roughly the same, and then things start to unravel just before the apex, where the slower lap is much wider at the apex, 1.56 meters wider. And also at this point in the datapack lap, Jeremy is already getting back on the throttle as he apexes, whereas on the slower lap he's having to hesitate and is still running wide, doesn't want to run off the track entirely, which is why he's had that throttle hesitation, but obviously why he's also therefore lost a load of speed exiting the corner. You can find all setups, replays and telemetry for your own use and analysis on virtualracingschool.com, where you can also book coaching including group classes with world champions from the likes of Koan de Simsport. Good luck for this week and feel free to post any questions or comments below. Thanks for watching.